Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I've got 10 Australian movies that you might not have heard of. I think I've mentioned one or two of them on the channel before, but for the most part there are 10 movies that I recommend and I think you should check out if you haven't. Not everybody is as au fait with Australian movies as I am, and so that's why I'm doing the video. Let's get started with something outrageous, something mad, something Brian Trenchard Smith. And it's from 1976, so you know it's good. It's a little mad film that Brian Trenchard Smith made. He had a pre-sale deal with Channel 9 to show it on TV. It's called Deathcheaters. It stars John Hargreaves and the stunt legend of Australian exploitation cinema, Grant Page, as a couple of stunt guys who also work for intelligence agencies. Now, I've talked about this one before. This is the Exploitation Classics edition from Umbrella Entertainment, and there are a ton of extra features on it. This movie is mad. I like it so much, even though it didn't make money. It has no realism to it at all. It's filmed around Sydney, and everything is shot beautifully. And I always like seeing my home city as it was in the 1970s. There are a few movies that show it, including Brian Trenchard Smith's Man from Hong Kong. Deathcheaters is a lot of fun. There's the two main characters, John Hargreaves as Steve Hall and Grant Page as Rodney Cann. Yeah, basically it's an excuse to put together a whole bunch of stunts and a whole bunch of explosions and a whole bunch of madness, along with a little bit of work with some character actors like Noel Ferrier playing an intelligence head who hires the guys to do something or other in a foreign country, which is actually not a foreign country. It's all filmed in and around Sydney. It's just mad and crazy and very 1970s. This one should be in your collection. If you're an exploitation fan, have a look at that bit at the bottom. They used to be the school bullies. Now they are kind to small dogs and big women. You gotta love that. There are so many extras on this edition, and also you get a comic book version of it, which is crazy and wonderful and worth it. These movies are the bread and butter for me, the stuff that I grew up watching. This one is all region as well, so if you get it from Umbrella's website, if it's still available. So yeah, that's the first one, Deathcheaters. I recommend it highly. It's just mad stunt work and a real love letter to that time in Australian cinema when we weren't taking everything seriously, or we weren't just doing horror films filmed in Adelaide. While we're on exploitation, I'll do another one. This one's a little less frivolous. It's a 1986 Australian action-adventure film about a young woman who runs a wildlife sanctuary, played by Cassandra Delaney, who's menaced by 3 kangaroo hunters who have entered the sanctuary looking for new game. And it's fair game. This movie is crazily good action. The female character does get abused during the movie and then goes on a revenge rampage. It's very much one of those kind of movies. The stunt work is fantastic, directed by Mario Andraccio, and it just has that gritty toughness and that outback location that really suits a certain kind of exploitation action film. Tarantino loves this movie. He talked about it a lot in Not Quite Hollywood, the 2008 Mark Hartley directed documentary about exploitation films. And you should have this one as well. This one might be a little harder to find, though I did see some copies on eBay, which sometimes is your way to go if you're looking for a specific exploitation film. They will show up in some edition on eBay fairly frequently. Might as well stay on a roll with exploitation. This one is the second sequel to a very successful horror film, which was made in the Pacific Northwest of America. But this is an Australian film, directed by Felipe Mora, who also directed Mad Dog Morgan. It's just over the top. It's designed to be humorous. And it's the Howling III, The Marsupials, which stars Barry Otto as a scientist who meets a young woman who is basically a part marsupial werewolf. Barry Otto is currently the subject of a documentary. He's fairly old these days and he is suffering from dementia. And there's a documentary about him and his daughter Miranda Otto, the actor. And I haven't seen the documentary yet, but I hear it's really great. And it's a kind of love letter to the career of Barry Otto. Howling III has a killer cast, apart from cameos from people like Bill Collins, who was the king of Australian movie criticism for a very long time. It's also got people like Michael Pate, who was in 1950s cinema in America, including The Court Jester, Frank Thring, who was the guy who was Pontius Pilate in Ben-Hur, Barry Humphries, and a lot of Australian actors like Burnham and Carol Skinner, Bob Barrett, and Imogen Annesley plays the marsupial girl. There's a lot of good makeup effects in this one. It's not to be taken seriously at all. It's a mad film, and you can see some of the makeup effects there. I remember at the time it first came out, people were slamming it hard. They didn't want Australian films to be like this one, but I love it for the fact that it is dumb, stupid, over the top. It's ambitious for what it does, and it just has a feel of the kind of movie that was shown in encore cinemas around Australia. Places like the Valhalla, for instance. There was a Valhalla in Melbourne and one in Sydney. They were showing these kind of movies on midnight sessions. I have such a love for that time and place and that way of delivering movies to an audience. These movies always delight me. Next up, I've got one I haven't got a copy of yet, but I'm putting it on my list. It stars one of the kings of Australian acting at the moment, Mendo, Ben Mendelsohn, who has turned up in Marvel movies, who has turned up in Star Wars movies. Fantastic character actor. Mendo can do no wrong, according to Australian film fans. And it's a movie from 1990, directed by Nadia Tass, called The Big Steal, about an 18-year-old guy called Danny, played by Mendo, who was around that age at the time. He lives in Footscray, a suburb in Melbourne, and he's looking for a way to secure the affections of a beautiful girl called Joanna, played by Claudia Carvin. And so instead of driving his Nissan Cedric, he gets conned by a very dodgy car salesman, played by Steve Bisley, who was Goose in Mad Max, and who sells him a Jaguar XJ6. Then he takes it away and it immediately shits itself, and he decides he's going to get his revenge on this guy whose name is Gordon Farkas, which is a great name for a car salesman. Farkas by name. It's just a lot of fun. I mean, it's got a good heart. The acting is fantastic. Bisley is great as the villain. And seeing Melbourne as it was in 1990 is great. This movie was created by Nadia Tass and David Parker, her partner, who did a number of quirky Australian films at the time. Man, even though it wasn't an enormous financial success, The Big Steal is still a lot of fun to watch. And it has a lot of good Australian actors in there. Damon Herriman's in there. He played Charles Manson in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for instance. It's just a lot of fun, and it's a good-hearted movie. Made a bit of money, but it's now kind of forgotten, and it shouldn't be. It's good to see actors who are now mature actors in their earlier roles. So you get that with Ben Mendelsohn. You also get it with Claudia Carvin, who's still acting, and Steve Bisley, who just turned up. He just turned up at the convention. Nice little film. You should check it out. It is available if you look around. Next cab off the rank is a movie from 1986, which was an interesting time in Australia as far as relations with Indigenous people were concerned. And it's kind of an alternate universe satire called Babakueria, which basically takes a piss out of race relations in Australia. It's set in a universe where a group of Indigenous people come to a new land called Babakueria and find white people as they were in 1986. They then flip the narrative that we know and treat them the way Indigenous people were being treated in the 1980s in Australia. I'll read a little bit off the back for you. The white Australian lifestyle is seen through patronising Aboriginal eyes within a pseudo-documentary format. Michelle Torres and Bob Mazza are supported by a number of familiar faces. So basically it's done documentary style and shows in a patronising way how the white people are treated in this alternate universe. It's a really interesting film, and I like it a lot. It is on YouTube. I have seen a copy of it on YouTube. Not the greatest definition copy, but it's a movie you should check out because the 1980s were a pivot point for Indigenous relations in Australia. When Australia was celebrating the bicentennial of colonisation, there were enormous, very peaceful and culturally rich protests done, including the Australia Day protest in 1988 in Sydney, where Indigenous mobs from all over the country came to Sydney to protest. There were 300,000, 400,000 people there. I know because I was there myself. I was part of that. But Babakueria is a great little piece of satire, pivoting things 180 degrees and showing white audiences, essentially, the disadvantage that Indigenous people have. In fact, this was used as a training movie for the New South Wales Police Force after it came out. Next one I've got for you is a kind of semi-documentary made in 1975 by Brian Trenchard Smith. And it's a movie about venereal disease. It's called The Love Epidemic, and it has a whole bunch of information because VD was rampant in the 1970s before a much more potent sexually transmitted blood disease came through. It has comedy sketches in it. It has serious statistical information. It has good health care information. And it's got a really interesting cast. Grant Page turns up in it. Grant Page is a stuntman. And this fictionalised version of Grant Page copped a dose in Hong Kong, comes back to Australia, finds a discharge, and Grant goes very bold places in that part of the film, and then goes and has it treated. There are also a number of other Australian actors who turn up. Ross Spears turns up. John Hewitt, one of the great Australian bands of the time, Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, turned up as well. It was made cheaply for $33,000 on 16mm, blown up to 35 for theatrical distribution. And I actually saw it in a cinema. And it was really interesting. In 1975, in January, 2 members of the cast sought an injunction to have the film withdrawn on the grounds that it was a pornographic film, and they had only agreed to make an educational one. They weren't successful in that. Movie got an R rating. According to Brian Trenchard Smith, it did okay, got its money back and made a small profit. So it's a kind of Mondo movie. There are a few different Australian Mondo movies, which might be worth doing a video about. There are about 3 or 4 of them, which are kind of interesting. I'm not sure how popular they'll be on the channel, so if you'd like to see me do a video about Australian Mondo-style movies, let me know because I will do it. Interestingly enough, the cinematographer for this was Russell Boyd, who went on to do a lot of movies you've heard of, like Tender Mercies, for instance, and the Eddie Murphy Dr. Dolittle. So you've got a direct connection from Eddie Murphy's Dr. Dolittle to this weird little semi-documentary made in 1975 in Australia. And I find that really interesting as well. It's a little bit hard to find copies of The Love Epidemic, but I did find a digital copy through slightly subterranean means. And it'd be interesting to see whether Umbrella or a company like that would be interested in re-releasing it at some stage in the future. Though it is a little difficult with 16mm blown up to 35mm. The grain on the film could make that a little bit problematic for a release in the modern digital age. Next up, I'm going back to 1940 for you. We're going deep cut. This one is available on physical media still from Umbrella. It's a movie directed by Charles Chauvel, who was the great 20th century film director in Australia for the earlier part of the century. It's about the Australian Light Horse Brigade in World War I. And it's a movie called 40,000 Horsemen, which was filmed in 1940 here in Australia. And it was basically about the light horsemen who are mounted riflemen, and talks about, very topically, the Battle of Gaza during World War I, where the Australians were fighting against the Germans. And it does a lot with a little. It stars Chips Rafferty and Graham Taylor as a couple of soldiers who are part of the Light Horsemen. They recreated a whole bunch of sets in the Middle East on the sandhills just south of Sydney, in the Kurnell Sandhills, an area I know fairly well. And they even built a mosque in the sand dunes. It's an incredibly brave and bold thing to do at the start of World War II to remind people of the heroics of World War I. Recreating the cavalry charge of the Battle of Beersheba was a really tough thing to do, but the Chauvels, Charles and his wife Ilsa, managed to do it. 40,000 Horsemen is one of those movies from the 1940s that shows that Australia can make really interesting, really powerful feature films. Of course, we have been doing it for 40 years at the time. That's another story about how the Australian film industry died out in the 1940s and didn't resurrect till the late 60s, early 1970s. But 40,000 Horsemen is one of those movies that I have a great fondness for because it's part of my cultural history. And I know where it was filmed. In fact, I've tromped around those sandhills a number of times in my misspent youth. Don't worry, you should check out. There are a whole bunch of those movies from the 1940s in Australia. Things like The Sons of Matthew, which is a really good one about timber cutters in Queensland. And in 1955, the Chauvel's made Jeddah, which is about a young Indigenous woman raised by white people and the cultural problems she has with that. A lot of good Australian films like that, which are really worth checking out if you are interested in Australian cinema. We're down to the last three, so I'll do the vampire film next. It's a 1979 film called Thirst, directed by Rod Hardy, produced by Anthony Igenin, who was the kind of Roger Corman of Australia at one stage. And it stars Chantal Conturi, Matt Phipps, David Hemmings is in there as well. Henry Silver is in there as well, because you bring in the overseas names for the name value. And it's about a young woman called Kate who gets kidnapped by an organisation called the Brotherhood, who are basically vampires living undercover in Australia. And they are milking humans for their blood. It's an interesting, mad film. It was filmed around the artist colony Montsalvat outside Melbourne. There's some wild scenes in this one. And while Australia hasn't done a lot of vampire films, the only other two I can think of are a really obscure one called Outback Vampires, and of course Daybreakers, the Sperry Brothers movie from about 2010. We should do more vampire movies. Horror is making a big resurgence here in Australia. So I want to see more vampire films in Australia, and Thirst is not the first Australian vampire film, but it's very much in the early part of Australian vampire films. I like it because it is silly, and you get to see Henry Silver falling out of a helicopter and being electrocuted on power lines. So there's always that to consider. It's fun, and you probably could match it up in a double feature with the Howling III Marsupials. We're down to the last two, and the next one is crocodile movie, because we have a lot of crocodiles here. I've swum in a tank with them. I've eaten them. I've held a baby crocodile. I've fed one half a chicken on a length of string. So crocodiles are something with which I'm very familiar. And this is a little movie from 1987 starring John Jarratt, who was, of course, in Wolf Creek and the sequel. And it's a nice little film called Dark Age, about a bunch of people who hunt a killer crocodile, and things don't go well. The nice thing about this one, apart from the fact that it is incredibly well made, is the use of Indigenous actors. Burnham Burnham's in there, and David Gulpilil's in there, and the supporting cast is really good. There are a few good crocodile movies made here in Australia, but this is probably the first really good one. The special effects work is really good. The suspense is really good. The use of Indigenous actors and acknowledgement of the sovereignty of the land to the Indigenous people makes this one a little bit special for the 1980s. Haven't watched this one in a while, but I'm inclined to watch it again, because I'm thinking of doing a crocodile movie video at some stage in the future, so getting a couple of these under my belt would be a nice thing to have. Strangely enough, this was filmed on the East Coast. It was filmed around Cairns and also a little bit in Alice Springs in the middle of Australia, whereas most of the later crocodile movies were filmed up in the Northern Territory or over in Western Australia. Pretty much the coastline of the top half of Australia, all the bits that go like that, are infested with crocodiles and sharks and things like irukandji jellyfish, which are this big and will probably kill you and put you in hospital if it doesn't kill you. I like a good crocodile movie, and this is definitely a good crocodile movie. The last one I got for you is my favourite Australian film of all time. 1978. It's a little movie starring Bill Hunter called Newsfront. Newsfront is about newsreel filmmakers who went out and shot news footage before television was a part of Australia. The narrative in the movie runs from 1945 until 1956, when television started in Australia and began to kill the newsreel footage industry. It's about a guy called Len McGuire, played by Bill Hunter, who is a newsreel photographer for one of the companies, and it talks about his life. It puts real life historical events using archival footage perfectly matched with newly filmed stuff. So there are things about the Maitland floods, for instance, where they have genuine footage of these floods in the 1950s, and they perfectly match it up with new stuff that they filmed down in the Narrabeen Lagoon much later, like in 1978. Really fine film. It was written by Philip Noyce. There's something about Newsfront which talks to the better nature of Australia as a country and the people of Australia. The generosity of spirit, the toughness, the healthy disrespect of authority. All of that's in here. Good supporting cast in there. You'll see people like Brian Brown turn up there. You've got John Hewitt. You've got Wendy Hughes in there as well. Just a lot of really fine Australian actors at the time. And the evocation of 1940s, 1950s Australia is done incredibly well. And this is the role that Bill Hunter, it's his best role ever. Really fine character actor. There's something perfect about Newsfront as an Australian film, and how it also addresses the change from the cultural imperialism of England to the later cultural imperialism Australia had inflicted upon it by America. So that transition is a part of the narrative as well. It's a really fine film. I don't know whether it will ever get a 4K release, but should it ever get a 4K or even a Blu-ray release, I'm there to get it. This one, of course, is the DVD version. And you can find these really cheaply on eBay for no good reason, because it's an extremely great Australian film that doesn't get as much love as a lot of lesser films and a lot of shit that Baz Luhrmann produces, for instance. So there are my 10 Australian movies that I recommend to you. I will post links on where you can get them. A lot of them you can get from Umbrella, but where you can't, I'll find other links. And if you are able to access Broly, the Australian streaming service, a lot of these films are available on Umbrella Entertainment streaming service Broly, which is BROLLIE.com.au. If you've got a VPN and you're overseas, you might be able to tap into it. I like these films a lot. I'm really fond of these films, and in the future I probably will do more videos just giving you 10 more Australian films that I think are really good. I think it's important for me to share the good parts of my culture with all of my audience who aren't in Australia, or even people who are in Australia who haven't watched these films yet. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment and tell me which ones of these films you'd like to see, or which ones you have seen and you like, because they are pretty good and I think fairly diverse group of films. It's a lot of exploitation in there, but then Australian cinema had a lot of exploitation in it. You can also support the channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, I've got the Wednesday video, and I've got some ideas for that. And while you're watching that video, I'm going on a country drive, so I'm going to be off in the sticks, probably searching for DVDs in an op shop. But until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch this movie. It's bloody superb. I'll catch you next time.